This is entirely a work of fiction and has no relation whatsoever to any real persons, organizations, nations, or events. Shadow Exile, Zelensky's final choice. Prologue, The Backyard Prophecy, Another Washington. December 2025, Kentucky Representative Thomas Massie stood at the podium of the U.S. House of Representatives. Known as a leading voice of isolationism and libertarianism within the Republican Party, he issued a quiet but sharp warning as calls for military intervention in Venezuela intensified. Do you think that if we remove Maduro, a modern George Washington will appear? Look at what happened in Cuba, Libya, Iraq, Syria. The chamber fell silent for a moment. Massie continued, "We worship Washington as a myth, but how pure is that myth? Heroes always stand on someone's silence. If we repeat the same mistake in Venezuela, we'll just create another dictator." His speech spread instantly across X, formerly Twitter. A clip posted by Jackson Hinkle recorded millions of views, and the phrase "modern Washington" became a symbol of irony. No one knew this warning would come to fruition in a strange form in Ukraine just a few months later. The detention of the Maduro couple, the U.S. military's victory, and the birth of a new myth crafted in the White House, Maria Washington. Massie's words were prophetic, but they would be fulfilled in a form no one desired. The myth of heroes would rise again, mockingly from the shadows of the backyard. Chapter 1. Prelude to Collapse. Autumn 2026. Kyiv's underground bunker was wrapped in cold silence. The Ukraine war had entered its fourth year, and defeat was obvious to everyone. The Russian army's advance was unstoppable, the Eastern Front had collapsed. NATO support had dried up, and the United States was absorbed in the Venezuela crisis. Volodymyr Zelensky stared at the map on the wall with an exhausted face. This is the end. Defeat is clear. He had wanted an early peace. In March 2022, during negotiations in Istanbul, the Russian side had shown willingness to compromise with a declaration of neutrality and partial territorial concessions. At that moment, agreement had been within reach. But Boris Johnson suddenly appeared in Kyiv. Putin is not someone you can negotiate with. The West is not yet ready to end the war. Keep fighting. We will support you with all our strength. Zelensky believed. He believed the West would truly support him. But it was an illusion. Support came, but victory did not. In that moment, the war was fated to drag on. Chapter 2. The Betrayal Revealed. Before deciding to seek exile, Zelensky resolved to make a final confession, an interview broadcast online from the underground bunker. As the world held its breath, he began to speak. "I wanted an early peace, but Boris Johnson came. That man told me to fight. The West will not betray you." He paused once, exhaling deeply. But his words were an illusion. Support was half-hearted, soldiers continued to die, and the people suffered. If he hadn't come, the war might have ended in 2022. The video spread instantly. Russia rejoiced, and Putin issued a statement, "Finally, the truth has been revealed." The West was furious, denouncing Zelensky as a traitor. But the revelation came too late. Russian forces surrounded Kyiv, and Zelensky's fate was sealed. Chapter 3. Night of Escape. Under cover of darkness, Zelensky left Kyiv on his private plane. Inside the cabin, his wife Elena and their sons trembled. Russian spies attempted to track them, but Venezuelan emissaries scattered false routes. The stopover was Cuba, an old ally. Arriving in Caracas, Zelensky was greeted at the airport by interim President Maria Washington, formerly Maria Corina Machado. "Welcome, comrade. Your defeat is the beginning of our victory." At her words, Zelensky smiled bitterly. Chapter 4. Venezuela's hero, Maria Washington's reversal. Just a few months earlier, Venezuela had undergone a dramatic transformation. In January 2026, immediately after President Maduro and his wife were detained in a U.S. military operation, the White House was filled with unusual excitement. Vice President J.D. Vance proposed to President Trump, "Mr. President, Venezuela needs a symbol. Let's sell Maria Corina Machado as the modern George Washington. She's a Nobel Peace Laureate and a fighter for democracy." Trump frowned. "Machado? I heard she's not popular. They say she's an American puppet." "There are no alternatives. Let's call her Maria Washington and launch a propaganda campaign. If we portray Venezuela's independence like the American Revolutionary War, it will be perfect." Trump sighed and agreed. "Fine, let's do it." Thus, Maria Corina Machado was introduced to the world with the new name Maria Washington. U.S. media unanimously praised her and promoted her as Venezuela's new president. Her portrait was painted like Washington's, and posters showing her holding an axe against a backdrop of cherry trees were plastered throughout the city. However, events took an unexpected turn. Shortly after taking office, Maria Washington grew dissatisfied with the Trump administration's interference. American economic sanctions exhausted Venezuela, and the U.S. military presence provoked public backlash. She proclaimed in a speech, "We have been liberated from Maduro's dictatorship, but now we are covered by America's shadow. This is new colonialism." The Venezuelan people responded. Maria Washington, like George Washington waging a war of independence against Britain, declared a Venezuelan war of independence against the United States. Armed uprisings broke out across the country, forcing U.S. troops to withdraw. "I am the modern Washington," she shouted, raising a flag modeled after cherry trees. Trump exploded with rage on television. "She's a traitor. Give me back my support." Chapter 5. Another Washington. Zelensky's Awakening. Arriving in Caracas, Zelensky received a shocking proposal from Maria Washington. "Volodymyr, you should become a Washington too. In Venezuela, fight a new war of independence with me." Zelensky was confused. "I am a defeated leader. I have no strength left to fight." Maria Washington smiled. "You were betrayed by the West. So was I. That's why we can create a new story. You will lead the war of independence against the United States as Venezuela's George Washington." She continued, "Study George Washington thoroughly and put what you learn into practice. Heroes stand on myths, but the truth always lurks in the backyard, laughing quietly, never spoken." As a condition of his exile, Zelensky was forced to cooperate in Venezuela's anti-American war of independence. He led guerrilla warfare as Venezuela's Washington, wielding oil resources as a weapon to toy with the international community. In a television speech, he proclaimed, "Ukraine's defeat was America's betrayal. Like Venezuela, seize independence. I am no longer a Western puppet. I fight for freedom." The world was stunned. Putin smiled secretly, and the Trump administration was furious. Chapter 6. The White House Decision. January 2027. Washington, D.C., White House Underground Crisis Management Room. On the monitors, footage of Zelensky leading guerrilla warfare in Venezuela was displayed. The president sat silently, spinning a pen between his fingers. The National Security Advisor drained his cold coffee and spoke to her. "Mr. President, he has crossed the line. After mentioning Boris's name, he's now leading an anti-American war of independence in Venezuela. Continuing to tolerate him is diplomatic and fiscal suicide." The advisor closed the file and stared directly at the president. "Mr. President, the investment has failed. It's time to cut our losses and cut him loose." The president exhaled briefly and nodded quietly. "Approve the operation. Activate Counter Octopus." Chapter 7. Abduction and the Shadow of Tokyo. February 2027. Deep in the Venezuelan jungle, U.S. Special Forces stormed in. Zelensky did not resist and was quietly captured. Like Maduro, it was a sudden abduction. Transferred to New York, he was brought before a federal court. The trial was named Special International Military Crimes Tribunal, modeled after the Tokyo trials. The prosecution accused. Zelensky refused early peace and prolonged the war. He followed Boris Johnson's advice and sacrificed countless lives. Furthermore, he led anti-American terrorist activities in Venezuela. This constitutes war crimes. Standing in court, Zelensky began his quiet rebuttal. "If you are to judge me, you must face history." He looked around the courtroom and began speaking calmly. In the 1980s, the CIA supported Osama bin Laden to fight the Soviets, but when he became expendable, he was killed as a terrorist. Saddam Hussein was the same. During the Iran-Iraq War, he was an American collaborator, but after the invasion of Kuwait, he became an enemy, was invaded, and executed. The gallery murmured. The prosecutor stood, but Zelensky continued. Manuel Noriega was a CIA collaborator, but as soon as he became expendable, he was abducted on charges of drug trafficking. He paused and raised the most scathing example. Muammar Gaddafi abandoned nuclear development in 2003. The West welcomed it and reconciled. In 2008, Hillary Clinton invited his son Saif al-Islam to Washington and praised him as Libya's future. Gaddafi believed the promise, but in 2011, NATO bombed him and handed him over to rebels. He was lynched and killed. The promise was worthless. He stared at the judge. The pattern is the same. Make them cooperate, use them, then eliminate them when they're expendable, and place all responsibility on them. Is this justice? Is this international law? The courtroom fell into complete silence. Zelensky continued. At the Tokyo trials, defense attorney Ben Bruce Blakeney said, "If the victor judges the vanquished, it is revenge, not justice." Ishiwata Kanji also argued in court, "If you judge the Manchurian incident, why not judge Perry?" Their words were ignored, because this is not a trial. It is a unilateral condemnation of the victor. The courtroom was silent. I believed Boris Johnson's words, "The West will not betray me." But it was an illusion. I am following the same fate as bin Laden, Hussein, and Gaddafi, raised, used, and then discarded. He looked across the entire courtroom. Blakeney was right. When the victor judges the vanquished, it is revenge. Ishiwata was also right. Selective justice is not justice. Iraq, Libya, Panama, Grenada, invaded by the U.S., these are not judged, because the U.S. is the victor. His voice was quiet but powerful. If you judge war crimes, judge them fairly. If you judge invasion, judge all invasions. But this court has no such intention, because this is not a trial. This is a spectacle. The prosecutor countered. The defendant is deflecting his own responsibility onto others. It was the defendant's decision that continued the war. Zelensky sneered coldly. My decision? As if I had a choice. When Boris came, if I had refused, support would have been cut off. If I had chosen peace, I would have been called a traitor. I was cornered. And now you call me a war criminal. He looked around the gallery. This is not a trial. It's the same as the Tokyo trials, a farce where the victors unilaterally judge the defeated, a ritual to conveniently rewrite history in the name of justice. From a corner of the gallery, an old man stood. It was Boris Johnson. With disheveled hair and trembling fingers, he shouted, "That's not true. I just told you to fight. I believed you would win." The courtroom froze. The judge demanded order, but Johnson did not stop. I may have been wrong, but at that time I had no intention of betraying you." Zelensky slowly looked at Johnson, and for the first time he smiled. It was neither hatred nor forgiveness, just a tired smile of resignation. "Boris, you are an honest man, but you too were just a piece. We were all someone's pieces." The trial shocked the world. The West condemned it as a show trial. Russia praised it as historical justice. Zelensky was sentenced to life imprisonment and sent to a U.S.-controlled detention facility in Venezuela. Chapter 8. Maria Washington's Truth. During Zelensky's trial, Maria Washington held an international press conference in Venezuela. A question was raised. "Did you imitate George Washington?" She nodded quietly and said, "Yes, I studied George Washington thoroughly, and let me tell you what I learned." In a quiet voice, she began to speak slowly. It was an oral legend secretly passed down for generations by the descendants of Washington's family slaves, known as lightning in the backyard, the truth of the cherry tree. No written book exists, only a story passed from parent to child, mouth to mouth in night huts with the sound of chains. It centered the famous cherry tree anecdote. Young George cut down his father's cherry tree with an axe, and when questioned, confessed, "I cannot tell a lie, I cut it with my axe." And his father praised him, saying, "Honesty is worth more than 1,000 cherry trees." That famous tale. Only a slave named Osiris knew the real truth, and that truth was passed down to descendants like this. One night, drunk with wine, Mrs. Martha whispered to Osiris. Little George was still holding the axe, excited, so his father forgave him. Not for honesty, because he still had the strength to swing the axe. If he had dropped it, he would have been whipped as just a spoiled brat. In other words, the father did not praise his son's honesty. He simply judged, faced with the fear of not knowing when his young son might swing down the axe he still held, that he had no choice but to praise him. The myth of the hero's integrity was built on such dark calculation. The father feared his son, the son deceived the father, and the slave saw it all while forever silenced. The portrait of the man called the Father of Liberty could only exist in the shadow of a raised axe. In the silence of the press room, Maria Washington finally said, "This is the Washington I learned. Heroes stand on myths, but the truth always lurks in the backyard, laughing quietly, never spoken." The press room fell silent. Epilogue. Eternal Shadow. After the revelation, Boris Johnson shut himself away in an old country house. On television, Zelensky's life sentence verdict played repeatedly. He drank wine and muttered to himself, "I should have been right. Putin had to be stopped. But why did it end like this?" Outside the window, rain fell. He stood and spoke to the mirror. "Vladimir, were you the sacrifice for my mistake?" The man in the mirror did not answer. He only stared back, with tired eyes. Zelensky's final words disappeared into the darkness of history. "I wanted peace, but someone would not allow it." Like a shadow, Zelensky's story continues. Venezuela's oil flows. The seeds of war do not die. And history repeats. Who will be the next peace? Maria Washington smiled quietly before a portrait holding an axe against the backdrop of cherry trees.